Hello and welcome everyone. Today I'm joined by Sarah Vaughan. Sarah, as some of you know, is an academic and author, and one of her latest books is on Tigray, titled Understanding Ethiopia's Tigray War. It's a book that she co-authored with Martin Plaut, and today she joined me to talk about some aspects of the topic that she covered in the book. And welcome to GAT, Sarah.
Thank you very much, Tekla. It's a pleasure and an honor to be with you.
It's my pleasure too. So maybe I'm going to take you directly into the thick of current events, Sarah, into what you think is happening in Ethiopia in relation to the Pretoria Agreement. You will have followed what has been happening in southern Tigray. There have been a flurry of statements from various bodies, from the African Union, from the American government, and from the British government. What do you think is happening in terms of the Pretoria Agreement?
I think it's really difficult to tell, and I'm far away. I'm in the UK, so not there day to day, but I think it's extremely worrying. It was very worrying to see the COHA, the Cessation of Hostilities Agreement, going on for so long without a real kind of thoroughgoing review in a very kind of formal way involving all of the international guarantors, African Union, of course, but also the Americans and others. So I think it was positive when they finally got around to that. What is it, about a month or 6 weeks ago now? It is clear that there are large elements of COHA that remain to be implemented. The most important of which, from Tigray's point of view, is the removal of foreign forces and non-federal forces from Tigrayan territory. So it seems that there's some moves since those meetings were held to start to move in that direction, which has got to be positive from the point of view of the return of IDPs. But we're very far from still things being implemented the way they should be according to the constitution. I mean, I think the Tigray administration, TPLF interpretation of COHA is very clear that it requires a return to the status quo ante. And that means a return to the borders as they were before the war started. That whatever else may be the pros and cons of other people's claims on this territory, you can't just simply overturn existing borders by force. So we need to get back to that position, and then we have some kind of negotiation, potentially including a referendum. That's what the constitution says is possible if there's a call for it and if certain conditions are satisfied. But you need to go back to the constitutional position before you do anything else. And I think one of the reasons why this was so difficult for the Tigray administration and so problematic is the number of people who are displaced and the appalling situation that they're placed in. And the appalling situation and extra burden that places on the population in Tigray. For instance, when I was in Tigray in November last year, I visited Ndabaguna. And that's a town which has a population of about 42,000 people under normal circumstances. It's hosting an extra 53,000 people. And it's already facing a very, very difficult economic situation because it's quite close to that border with Western Tigray and trade routes are cut and so on. So you can imagine the stress. You can imagine what's happened to rents in the town. It's really, really difficult from so many different levels, not just the sort of basic food and water and sanitation and housing that IDPs need, but the impact that has on the overall community. So this is urgent, and it's still urgent. And I hope that there will be further moves. But for me, it's impossible to see any of those IDPs going back to areas that they come from without their security being ascertained. And it's certainly impossible for Tigrayans from Western Tigray to go back to Western Tigray whilst the, let's say, clearly illegal Amhara annexation administration is still in place. So that needs to be resolved. And my understanding of COHA, I think, is that that's the responsibility of the federal government. They need to step up and bear their responsibilities. But of course, we now have a federal government which is not taking many of its responsibilities terribly seriously, particularly when they relate to rural populations who are kind of out of sight, out of mind, and easily forgotten. So I think, let's see. This very frightening period. I think, when really The important thing about Koha is the cessation part. Those hostilities need to stay, not flaring up again. I think the Tigray Regional Administration, TPLF, need to be congratulated for not succumbing to what must have been a temptation to get involved with federal government's fights with Eritrea or federal government's fights with the Amharas. They seem to have kept their hands out for most of the last year. And I think that was the right strategy, though terribly frustrating and huge social and political cost domestically within Tigray.
And of course, some of these problems were, problems that you predicted might happen. And indeed, in the book that I mentioned in the afterword, which I think you wrote in November 9, 2022, so this would have been a couple of days after the signing of the agreement, you wondered openly in the book whether the agreement was going to be implemented in good faith, and you provide context under which the two parties were forced to sign the agreement. You say that the Americans and the other people who were forcing them to sign the agreement showed them the macabre nature of the war, and the reason why they signed was because they were made to see the humongous damage that the war did, but otherwise it wasn't really signed in good faith, and that as a result there would be problems in implementing the agreement. I think that is what you said in the afterword. What were you worries then, and how have things materialized following that?
I mean, we felt at the time, and remember that afterward was written between Pretoria and Nairobi. So it was really kind of, I mean, and I'm not a journalist, I'm an academic and a historian, a political scientist. I prefer a few years of water to flow under the bridge before we start trying to figure out what happened. So it was an interesting process to be co-authoring a book with a journalist who's much more, in real time. But it was clear that Koha was a very, very important kind of full stop on one period that we were talking about in the book. And it seemed important to respond to it. So I think I was very clear that, the federal government only agreed to Koha because it was under intense pressure internationally and it needed money. It was running out of money. It was under acute economic pressure. And if it hadn't been, it wouldn't have signed. And I think even then we saw that period leading up to the beginning of November where it was quite clear that there was a lot of prevarication, that, there was supposed to be talks in October and then they didn't happen. And then there was a few days, even when the teams were in Pretoria, where people from the federal side were dragging their feet, thinking that they could get closer to Mekelle and maybe even take Mekelle, and that would put them in a stronger position. And of course, from the Tigray side, I mean, it was awful. That I think we tend to forget, and in a sense, it's a regret for me that our book doesn't focus enough, I think, on this 10 weeks of fighting in 2022, from, what was it, about the 23rd of August through until the beginning of November. That was purely horrific, that period. And the number of casualties I mean, not that the early period wasn't also, but the idea that this was then happening again, and all of those towns along the north being invaded again from Eritrea was really a terrifying process, I think, for everybody. I'm sure sitting in the diaspora, you felt the same thing. We really wondered whether there would be a Tigray left at the end of this. So it was an existential decision for the Tigray administration. You notice I don't quite know what to call them. I don't know if it is TDF or TPLF but the Tigrayan leadership anyway. I think it was a brutal decision. It meant rolling back the political premises for the war. The idea that Tigray had the right under the constitution, under the spirit of the constitution, if not the letter of the constitution, to conduct elections on schedule, not to delay them. That administration that came out of that election in 2020 was legitimate. It meant abandoning all of that, saying, yes, okay, we were wrong. But, under the circumstances, I think they made the right decision. I don't see how Tigray could possibly have continued with a political principle when the cost was so egregious.
Well, I take your point that you are an academic and not a journalist, so you're not maybe not following events on a daily basis, and you don't want to speculate. But the other point that you mentioned in the afterword is whether or not peace and justice would both be achieved. And from what I see it now, I don't see any any effort being exerted to achieving justice. If anything, it looks like justice has been brushed aside as an inconvenient thing to be discussing about. And the international
I
community,
completely
as
agree with you, Tigray. I would go
yeah,
further, actually. I mean, I don't think there's either peace or justice. I mean, there's an absence of hostilities, but that's not the same as a sustainable peace. For many people in Tigray, they're starving. They still don't know where their relatives are, who died, who didn't die. They don't know whether they'll ever be able to go back home. That's not peace in any normal sense of the word. The situation of women in Tigray remains absolutely horrendous. And I think that was one of the things that struck me most forcibly when I was visiting at the end of last year, was, seeing women and girls all over the rural areas spending hours walking to collect water from water points, which are very far away, very few, villages being rationed as to, which days of the week they can go and collect water, because so many of those water points have been deliberately either poisoned or destroyed. So, these are things which I was used to in the 1980s. At the end of the Derg, when I first visited Tigray, you used to see people. The only thing that's changed is that they're no longer using those awful shekla pots, which used to break people's backs, but they're now, at least they have plastic jerry cans. But this means a huge impact on the situation of women. So I mean, we talk a lot about the rape survivors, but it's not only those who've survived sexual violence whose lives have been irreparably changed as a result of this war. And I'm particularly concerned about the overall situation of women who were quite visible during the war. Certainly many of the spokespersons in the diaspora, many of your colleagues were young women who were extremely effective and extremely articulate. I think the most disturbing thing about Koha was the way women disappeared. It's almost overnight. We were back to generals smoking cigarettes, making deals, kind of thing. I mean, I'm exaggerating, and there's a role for that as well. It's important, but I find it very disturbing that I don't see women in decision-making roles. Okay, we had one woman on the TPLF delegation to this review of Koha, but I mean, this fantasy of Abiy bringing a gender-balanced government that was peddled in 2018. So I'm digressing a little bit, but I evaluate a sustainable peace in terms of the situation of the mass of the population and the weakest in the population, the most disadvantaged. And I don't think they would consider what they have in Tigray at the moment to be peace. I certainly don't think there's anything other than a kind of performance of justice. Now, if the international community, as they seem to be, is satisfied with a transitional justice process, which is, in my view, a joke, and they know it's a joke because, they've done the research. To Harvard University sent out survey teams and collected the data, the evidence of what Ethiopians think of this transitional justice process. And the figures are particularly clear for Tigray, but they reject it. It's not something which is acceptable. So, and I think some of the institutions in Addis Ababa that should have been the vehicles for a new commitment to justice in Ethiopia, the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission and so on, I think we've seen where their real interests lie, given that they lobbied so hard to get the UN International Commission of Human Rights experts on Ethiopia shut down. Had they been really committed to human rights, it seems to me that the domestic institutions, Commissioner Daniel Bakale and his colleagues, would have welcomed the existence of the UN Commission, because in a sense it protects their flank. They can do the really radical critique of government, and it gives them more space to do some thorough investigations and really start to change the situation of human rights monitoring in Ethiopia. But of course, they took exactly the opposite strategy. So I'm afraid I'm not very optimistic about the prospects either for the sustainable, real, active peace that we would like to see, the return to stable livelihoods of people across Ethiopia, but particularly in rural areas. And I think, one of the most important components of transitional justice for me is this idea of the guarantee of non-repetition of crimes and atrocities. And it seems to me that when you've got large parts of the population in Tigray who are still living either with the actuality of occupation or with the threat of occupation, that's really problematic. So, certainly when I was there in October, November, people were very, very anxious about the idea that there might be another war with Eritrea. Now, maybe that possibility has faded in between, but that doesn't mean to say that, most peasant farmers, young people feel secure in their future. And of course, we see very many people leaving the region. I think that's a really terrible indictment of the leadership on all sides, if you like.
But I guess your point, but many people that I speak to, including myself, struggle to understand the reason why the international community is absolutely uninterested in pursuing justice, because you say that guaranteeing of non-repetition would be an absolute imperative in countries like Ethiopia, where violence is breeding violence, where the country seems to be in the grip of constant cycle of violence. And you would think many people would see this and say, maybe we have to set a precedent. We have to say that if you are trying to get away with murder, we're not going to sit idly by. But that is not happening, and many people struggle to rationalize that, to see the point, what the thinking of the international community is. I see that, of course, there is a desire to want to support Abiy, but it doesn't quite make sense to me, the rationale. So maybe if you could say a few words about that.
Yeah, I mean, this is part of the main reason why I agreed to be involved with this book project. I just thought it was really urgent to put a different narrative of the war, because the rubbish coming out of Addis Ababa, let me be clear, the lying coming out of Addis Ababa about, this is a law and order operation, these guys are out of control, was really just widely accepted, and particularly by people who were relatively new to Ethiopia. I mean, I think there's a sort of structural problem with the international community in that diplomats only stay in a country a few years. So, many of those diplomats, journalists who arrived in 2016, 17, 18, basically swallowed the narrative that, the TPLF were the spawn of the devil and responsible for every one of Ethiopia's problems, which was being actively promulgated at that time. So I think that the sort of baseline for a very effective narrative was laid before Abiy came to power. And I suspect that the TPLF didn't quite appreciate how effective that was. But certainly after Abiy came in, and after ISAT, for instance, was allowed to broadcast in Ethiopian homes, that made a big difference very quickly. I mean, I remember friends, including Tigrayan friends, whose attitudes really changed, who became very critical of federalism, critical of EPRDF. TPLF is the problem, they've ethnicized politics and so on, which, I mean, to me, this is a nonsensical narrative. There are all sorts of problems with federalism, and I'm sure we'll come on to some of them. But, just blaming this sort of group of crazed Marxist-Leninists who are responsible for all of the country's problems, this is not the way to broker a transition. But of course, the international community fell for it as well. I think we talk in the book about, there's a nice paper which was done by a couple of social scientists called Who Lost Ethiopia? And it's talking about how American politicians in particular were really susceptible to Abiy's nonsense, because he was telling them that, well, of course, the TPLF are close to the Chinese, and if you want Ethiopia to be liberal and to come into your camp, then I'm your man, and you have to help me deal with these guys. I think the geopolitics is really important. We now live in a multipolar world, and that's something which certainly the United Kingdom, the European Union, North Americans, the West, if you like, are really struggling to deal with. And of course, now they're completely distracted. I mean, there's almost no resources being put into the Horn. The situation in Sudan, for instance, which is heading in just as bad a direction as the situation in Tigray was, is getting some attention, but nothing like what it should, and nothing like the resources that it needs to feed a population in a terrible situation. So there's a problem of bandwidth. There's a problem of ideology. There's a problem of, Abiy's kind of all we've got. I think there was a real division in the international community. There were very, very few governments, one in particular, who were a bit more principled in their attitude on the Tigray War, basically because they saw Abiy as part of the problem, whereas most European and North American governments saw Abiy as part of the solution. And I think, until you understand that the current prime minister really is the source of a lot of Ethiopia's current problems, we're not going to make much progress. But of course, that's very difficult for diplomats. Their natural incentive structure is to do their jobs. They have to be in the room. And to be in the room, they need not to offend the guy. So, there's an awful lot of currying favor that goes on. The other problem, I think, is the Addis Ababa bubble. And I think we'll probably also get to that in this conversation about how everything is focused on Addis Ababa. And, the diplomats don't often get out of Addis Ababa. If they do, they don't get much beyond Mekelle or Hawassa. And the combination of insecurity, massive increase in insecurity, particularly since 2018, means that people don't travel. COVID meant that people got out of the habit of traveling. There's very, very little first-hand, on-the-ground research, whether it's journalists, diplomats, or academics going on. When I consider the amount of research that was going on the ground, anthropologists, journalists, all sorts of people, development practitioners, crawling all over the country, basically. I myself, in the 2000s, used to drive absolutely all over the place, spending weeks in Benchmaji and North Omo and Gambela and Afar. That's unthinkable now. So I think people don't have good information, which doesn't mean to say they don't know what's going on, but it means to say that it's kind of out of sight, out of mind. And I think that's a really big problem. And it was a huge problem for Tigray when, the fact that it's possible for a government to switch off the internet. I mean, they've had the internet off in large swathes of Oromia since January 2019, I think, and nobody talks about this anymore. Similarly in Amhara now, we really don't know enough about the situation in Amhara. And it worries me very greatly that some of those areas where there's a lot of insecurity, because of this counterinsurgency against the Fano activities, these are food insecure areas. How on earth are people feeding themselves? We don't know. And, the UN agencies, the NGOs, who should normally have people on the ground, also don't know. But the last thing they want to do is admit that they don't know. So, this is a big, big issue. And it means that if the government provides a clear narrative and says this is what's happening, the easiest thing for diplomats to do is to accept that. So, I mean, it is very difficult. And now if you're looking at the situation in Ethiopia, it's all very well for me to sit here as an academic and say Abiy's part of the problem, but then what do you do about it? What should be the role of partners? And don't forget that Ethiopia is still pretty much the biggest development and emergency recipient overall for many international donors, though not per capita, of course, because it's such a big country. The other thing I think that's really important is the rise of middle powers, and middle powers who are not particularly amenable to being told what to do or being encouraged to play by the rules of international law. So I'm thinking particularly of the Gulf states and particularly of the United Arab Emirates. I mean, I think there was almost no traction for the notion that the Emiratis were really, putting their finger on the scale in favor of Abiy and the idea of Emirati drones at the beginning of the war. People laughed it out of court, whereas I think it's now clear what was going on. But now this sort of enormous financial largesse on a very personalized basis between the leader of the Emirates and the leader of Ethiopia really makes it very, very difficult for people who want to talk about national dialogue or peace building or transitional justice. I mean, that's so far off the agenda of the Gulf states. And I think now that's more visible to people because it's more visible in the Sudan case. You know, you even had the UN head of the Under Secretary General for Political and Political Affairs, I think the week before last, basically said, you know, the Sudan situation is exacerbated by outside meddling. She didn't name who she meant, but it was pretty clear, and said this is immoral, it's illegal, and it must stop. You know, we needed that kind of statement at the beginning of the Tigray War, but we didn't get it. So I think, you know, there's a real problem with this proliferation of middle powers and Gulf states.
Well, interesting insights. And you mentioned, Sarah, you mentioned diplomats and how their views of Ethiopia is shaped by their Addis Ababa experience, because they don't tend to venture out Addis Ababa, and if they do, it's Matala and not much else. And you actually recount an interesting story in the book about how some diplomats in Addis Ababa in 2018, at the height of Abiy mania, reacted to the widespread hatred towards Tigrayans. They reacted by saying that for the Tigrayans to receive this sort of vituperation and hatred, they must have done something terribly bad, and whatever is happening to them must be deserved. That is how they reacted. And presumably you believe that there is an element of that even today. They say, well, what, you know, the Ethiopian government is doing in Tigray might be terrible, but maybe that is how they could be contained. Do you think there is that element of that, or am I pushing it too far?
I think, yeah, no, I think there is still an element of that. And it's reinforced on a sort of almost daily basis by an Ethiopian Addis Ababan elite, which works in many of these international missions and embassies, which has a tendency, and certainly in 2018-19 had a very strong tendency to applaud the government narrative and to applaud the ESA narrative. And they were delighted to see the Tigrayans humiliated after feeling that they had been occupying too much power since 1991. So I think there is a middle class constituency. I mean, I've experienced this myself, talking with you know, very skilled, otherwise very professional, very, you know, committed development practitioners who also were thoroughly fed up with people like me going on and on about what was happening in Tigray. This narrative, well, they're only 6% of the population. Why don't we talk about the rest of the country? To which my answer was, because it's the Tigray War, which is the worst situation in the country at that time, certainly. And it's the Tigray War, which is, you know, which is absorbing the resources which are going to pay for your kids' education, your kids' healthcare. You know, you should care about this and not just think, well, they're just a small group and we don't care about them. So there's a bit of a kind of vindictiveness. I think there's a bit of anti-Tigrayan sentiment, which I think has been really inculcated. You know, groups don't hate each other for no, you know, just they wake up one morning and decide we really hate our neighbors. There's usually something which is being kind of fabricated, a narrative which is being reproduced. And I think the combination of, we talk in the book about 3 different sets of kind of opponents of EPRDF, but TPLF in particular. In the 1990s, some of the ethno-nationalist movements who were maneuvered out, the OLF, the Sidamas, and so on and so forth, the ONLF, of course, the Ogaden group. Secondly, then the Eritrean government, especially after 97 and 98 and the outbreak of the Ethiopia-Eritrean War. And then thirdly, of course, this group of ethno-nationalists tracing their roots back to EPRP, EHAPA, and, you know, tracing forward. So you've got the EHAPA, Knijit to Izema nowadays. And that trend of centrism, which allied with the Eritreans, of course, you know, you had Gabot 7 taking up soccer in Asmara and being actively supported. But I think some of the insidiousness of the anti-Tigray, not just anti-TPLF narrative of the Eritreans is really quite remarkable. And that's been kind of amplified and taken up by some in this centrist political groupings. So this is why I say I think that the kind of return of ISAT, if you like, from the diaspora into domestic politics and across millions of Ethiopian homes had a terrible impact. and I don't think current diplomats still really understand what mistakes were made, and quite how difficult this is. I suspect also, I think, Tigrayan elites were a bit slow, including the TPLF, were a bit slow to realize why was. They kind of got used to the diaspora was sitting in Washington complaining, the people who left at the end of the Derg, they've always hated us. And it's true that a lot of the rhetoric goes back to the early 1990s. But quite how vicious some of those, returning Derg officials, returning opponents would become, and quite how vicious the combination of that and this newly ethnicized nationalism in the Amhara region, I think, was a surprise and a shock to everybody.
Well, but isn't it extraordinary, Sarah, that more than 500,000 people are believed to have died in the Tigray War, and that fact alone should compel people to reconsider their assumptions. So you would think that should happen, but that it is not happening. Nobody is trying to question their assumptions, and one wonders why it is that fact alone, never mind the other thing, who is at fault and everything else, that fact alone for me should force people to reflect on their assumptions, and especially diplomats and journalists, on all those people involved in those sort of roles. But that is not happening, and I don't really understand why
No,
there
I
is
agree.
absolute sort of disregard.
Yeah, it's very frustrating. It's very, more than frustrating. It makes one extremely angry that people don't dig a little bit deeper, or people who know better are still talking absolute nonsense. I mean, there are a few people. I'm not, condemning everybody outright. There are some people who do understand and who've really taken the time and are very thoughtful about what's happening in Ethiopia. But we do also have a cohort of some quite senior diplomats who are, complicit in promoting this nonsensical theatre of transitional justice, for instance, knowing damn well that it means absolutely nothing to the victims, and that it's not what they want, and knowing that that is a core principle of any successful transitional justice project, that it must give the victims the voices that they need. So, I think this summer we might see a change. I think Sudan has given people pause. We also have a whole generation of diplomats who will be leaving this summer. And maybe their successors will be coming in with a different perspective, and they will be a little bit more realistic. But on the other hand, there is also the issue of leverage. Ethiopia's got a reputation for not being very susceptible to external pressure. And I think that's a reputation that was kind of relatively well earned. Ironically, it was a reputation that was earned under TPLF leadership. It was Meles who wasn't susceptible to outside pressure. I think Abiy is all too susceptible to outside pressure. I think he's now, a creature of the Gulf states, of the Emiratis. So, for instance, this wonderful theatre that we had in the first few days of January with the MOU on the Somaliland land grab, I think that was very much driven by other people's interests. So it's kind of ironic, if you like, that the Ethiopian government in the last few years has gone on and on and on about sovereignty and don't undermine my sovereignty, at a time when they are the ones who've done most to undermine Ethiopia's sovereignty by a really erratic and ill thought out and personalized foreign policy. I mean, the foreign policy lurches from one direction to another, particularly vis-a-vis Somalia, Somaliland, Puntland, are really remarkable. I don't think we've ever seen this kind of crazy foreign policy.
Well, yeah, we could be talking about this all day, but we're going to zoom out from what's happening today, and we're going to sort of focus on the point that you cover in the book. Essentially, my understanding that you provide political and historical background to understanding the Tigray War. And as I mentioned in one of my text messages, a lot of Tigrayans that I speak to trying to understand why it is that the thing that happened to us for the past 4 years happened to us, why it is that in 2018 we were not in a position to defend ourselves, and invariably they go to 1991. And the understanding that Tigrayans, with the vantage point of now, with all the benefit of hindsight, the understanding they have is that in 1991, the TPLF and the EPRDF had their priorities wrong. And in the book, he said that they had 3 priorities. One was to decentralize the state. The other was to sort of liberalize the economy. And I think the third, I forgot, was to democratize.
Democratization, it's easily forgotten.
Yeah, but protecting Tigray from future, because Ethiopia had a history of attacking Tigray when the time was favorable, but that didn't seem to have been one of the assumptions of the TPLF. It didn't occur to them to think, now that we have the levers of power, we have to go out of our way to make sure that Tigray is some sort of fortified in some sense. That wasn't their priority. But what were the assumptions they had then? Because you know in detail their thought process in 1991.
Yeah, I think they were, I mean, they really were trying to play a straight wicket. I know that probably sounds kind of naive, but they really were trying to bring about a change in Ethiopia's sort of distribution of power, if you like, which had been hugely centralized for a very long time, increasingly under Haile Selassie and then during the Derg. And they basically wanted to bring about a situation where Ethiopians could be Ethiopians and Tigrayans, Ethiopians and Oromos and Somalis and Sidamas and so on and so forth. I always remember an interview I had with Sefhat Nagar at the time. He said, we want to have succeeded until we have a Muslim prime minister and a Gambala president. Just a kind of recognition of the depth of discrimination that there was. And let's be clear, Tigrayans were not in the most discriminated groups. They had suffered economically and in terms of access to the higher echelons of power with the rise of Shoa, if you like, and the moving of power south after Johannes. But, they were still a kind of part of the old Abyssinia, let me call it, for lack of a better word. So they were relatively in a better situation than some of these areas, which were basically treated as slave areas, and actually still are. I mean, if you hear some of the way that, we even hear about Zelimbet and this horrible kind of terminology towards some of the communities in Western Tigray and Benishangul Gumuz now coming back and being used by some centralist highland politicians. It's horrible. So, we're not far from slavery. I mean, slavery went on from the Western lowlands in Ethiopia right through until the 1970s. So that kind of huge racism, let me be clear about it. I mean, Ethiopians are remarkably color conscious, remarkably conscious of differences in terms of a hierarchy. And that was something that was in many ways exacerbated by traditional political culture, arguably by the Orthodox Church, by the hierarchy between the Orthodox Church and then the Muslim faith and the other churches. And so this was a kind of really heavy burden that needed to be overturned, if you like. So I think there was a lot of focus on that. I mean, this is having decided that you want to be part of Ethiopia. And I mean, the famous quotation attributed to Meles that, when did you decide that you couldn't be an independent state? And he said, well, when we looked around us and saw what resources we had. And there is something very important in that. And there's something very important that relates to Eritrea in all of this as well. I mean, I've heard academics, including the late Harold Marcus, saying there's something of the same going on in Eritrea. Because they haven't capitalized on the resources that they do have. It's also, not clear how Eritrea becomes a wealthy state. Anyway, So I think, having decided that you want to be part of Ethiopia, you then start to think about what kind of Ethiopia do you want. And at that point, they really were treading a very fine line, I think, between becoming the new Showens, just dominating everything, which of course is what they've been accused of anyway. And really, I think what was closer to the truth of bending over backwards to try to be even-handed, to try to make sure that, that there were certain development projects which didn't go ahead because the optics were that they would have been advantaging Tigray, and that Tigray shouldn't be seen to be growing or developing or flourishing at the expense of the other regional states. I think that was an ethical strategy. It was an ideological decision, but it was also a decision that, if this is going to work, it has to be about equity. However, on paper, you've got a constitution which is not just federal, it's confederal. Residual sovereignty under the constitution, which of course we are quite a long way away from in practice now, is with the regional states. So, this is something where you could actually start to see, and which is also the reason why, in principle, it wasn't that unreasonable for the Tigray government in 2020 to say, no, we can't delay the elections. We do need to have the elections. And although they may have needed the say-so of the National Election Board, actually, that was in line with the spirit of the constitution, that this electoral cycle shouldn't be tampered with unless there is a state of emergency, which at that point hadn't been declared in those terms. Abiy could very easily have postponed the elections in accordance with the constitution by declaring a state of emergency and then preparing to have elections the day after it was lifted. And that might have been different, but I think that wasn't what he was interested in. So it's all very well to say that, Tigray should have been stronger and more autonomous and had more resources, but that would have had to have applied to all of Ethiopia's regional states. And I think there were some reasons why there was nervousness about allowing this process to go ahead of the kind of political development of the country, was the way it was seen. One was what happened in the Ogaden in 93, 94. And, it was probably Ethiopia's freest and fairest ever election took place in the Somali region in that period. And it brought the ONLF to power, and they promptly tried to secede. And this is where the federal government kind of came back in and clamped down, the transitional government at the time. So there was this idea that, we've got this fiction of a kind of coming together Ethiopia, whereas actually what we're dealing with is a way to make Ethiopia hold together. You also had the OLF, who wanted increasingly to secede and wanted to be left to their own devices. So, you've got this slightly schizophrenic approach to, you really believe in the principles that all of these units should develop autonomously and with their own leadership and doing what they do, but they have to play within certain rules. And actually a lot of them are already not wanting to do that. So the problems with the OLF, the problems with the ONLF convinced them to be continuing some of that centrist top-down. So there are a couple of instruments in the constitution. I think it's chapter 10, which basically gives kind of control of policy making to the federal government. And then, of course, the fact that the federal subsidy is coming, taxes are collected at the centre and dispersed to the regions, which is the real kind of power that the centre retained. Now, if you've got a sensible leadership at the centre, then this should be okay. And if you've got a kind of evolution of fraternal regions which kind of understand that federalism is a bit of a kind of give and take, then that should be okay. But the minute you've got the largest by far of the regions that suddenly decides, actually, we can leverage our power around Addis Ababa and we can take the whole thing, thank you very much, then the whole thing kind of falls apart. So I'm not sure that one can blame the TPLF or the EPRDF for the fact that Tigray wasn't in a stronger position. And it's hard to imagine how any federated unit in a kind of democratic federal country could avoid, you can't plan for the sort of psychopathic cruelty with which Tigray was invaded. So I think it's not reasonable to, in a sense, to blame anyone other than the people who led that campaign in 2020. Having said that, there are some mistakes, I think, that were made during federalism, and they probably need to be fleshed out more thoroughly. I mean, one of them was, as you'll see from the book, I mean, I divide the federal period very clearly into two halves, pre-Meles and post-Meles. And, you know, I think things worked when you have a strong leader who's pretty pragmatic, understands the optics, can keep the kind of different actors in play, and they stop working so well once you don't have that kind of exceptional leadership. I mean, I was brought up to believe in, you know, structural factors and ideologies and so on, but the older I get, the more I think individuals do matter, and Meles mattered a lot. I'm not sure, you know, we would even have seen the emergence of EPRDF without his input.
But not to interject you, Sarah, but one of the criticisms leveled against Meles is that he designed a system that would work as long as he was in charge. He didn't care what would happen if he wasn't around. I think that is one of the things that people say about Meles. But sorry, continue.
I mean, well, that brings me sort of fairly neatly to one of the biggest criticisms, which I think can be levelled at the EPRDF and arguably could be levelled at Meles, which is that they tended to recruit people in the early period who were dependent on them. So they recruited cadres, you know, all over the country. I mean, including in Tigray and Amhara, but certainly in the south and Oromia and Gambela and Somali. They recruited what a German colleague of mine called the lumpen intelligentsia, people who had a little tiny bit of education, primary school teachers, but they didn't recruit the high school headmasters and so on, people who had a bit more independence, social capital, better education, who could be more autonomous and independent-minded in their judgment. And very often, for instance, those people went into the opposition. So in the south, for instance, Bayani Petros's Hevret hoovered up some of these more elite people who went into the opposition, whilst the PRDF was hoovering up the people who were really going to be dependent on them. And that meant that you had really weak leaders. You know, later on, you know, you've ended up with a bunch of yes men in and around Abiy. I mean, these are still EPRDF cadres, so the best that EPRDF had to offer. It's a pretty grim situation. So one can say that maybe Meles and those around him were too comfortable to take a fairly quick and easy route, whereas actually they should have done more to create a wider coalition of people who might have been more difficult to convince, but would have, you know, meant that there was more energy and more intellectual credibility within the organization. I think the other issue, which I think in retrospect, and actually at the time, people were worried about being a mistake, was that there was still too much economic resource and development at the center. Addis Ababa is a kind of real center of gravity. And I mean, it's really important to remember where Ethiopia was back in 1991. I mean, it's a really different country. It's a much smaller population. It's a tiny, flatlining economy. Addis was a village. You know, it's kind of barely reached the extent of the current ring road, let alone, you know, all of those wider areas. And there was a lot of work was done in the 1990s to push resources and people and decision-making out of Addis Ababa. And it was incredible. It was really fast. It was really dramatic. You had this first wave when Bahardar, Mekelle, and Hawassa and so on were established in the teeth of middle-class opposition, let's be clear. You know, also in Mekelle, for instance, people hated the fact that their rents were going sky high because of a whole bunch of civil servants moving in. It really had a kind of very disruptive social impact. And the same thing all over the country. You had a second wave of that in 2000, 2001, when you had Warada-based decentralization. You remember, probably too young, but the budgets were decentralized to Waradas. That was a really big deal. But somehow after that, it kind of lost its way. And you still had a lot of development was being established in and around Addis Ababa and the development corridor going south. And so, you know, land rates were skyrocketing in parts of Oromia. You can understand why, you know, foreign direct investors, if you're growing flowers, you might be able to get great land in Amhara near to Bahir Dar, but, you know, it's not going to be as close as Y is to exporting to the markets in Amsterdam. So guess what? Everything ends up close to Addis. I think that a really kind of neat illustration of this problem, which wasn't quite being thought about seriously enough, was, I don't remember which year it is, when we first saw the map of the planned new railway network. This is before Meles died, I think the mid-2000s. And it really was a spider's web, and everything focused on Addis. And in a sense, by then, you would have hoped that there could have been a really different kind of network of transport links could have been imagined, where everything didn't have to come to Addis and out again. This is not an uncommon problem. We have a terrible problem of, you know, concentration of wealth and development in London, for instance, in the UK. So, but it is something where I think they kind of slightly lost the focus after a while and forgot just how much was going on in Addis. And of course, that's now created a terrible problem because of the concentration of resources. It's very hard to see how that's going to be resolved going forward. I think then, I mean, there are all sorts of mistakes that were made during the Haile Mariam period. I think not probably from the sort of point of view of what should one criticize the TPLF or the EPRDF for. I think perhaps not taking seriously enough this emerging tension between Amhara and Tigray elites. Obviously, I mean, we talk in the book about the kind of factors which led to the idea that Western Tigray was contested land, which, you know, this for me, okay, there are one or two things which go back longer, but this was an invention, if you like, of the later period. And I think it's really problematic that there are a number of international diplomats who've swallowed this idea of contested territory. Crisis Group I would single out as having been responsible for peddling the idea. That's Amnesty as well, in a couple of reports they've put out. Yeah, Western Tigray wasn't contested the way people think it is contested now. You know, there was a bit of chuntering, a bit of murmuring. And the fact that, you know, what was called Tigray under the Imperial Tigray Gazette is different from what then became Tigray under the federal borders. Yes, you can see how some sloppy and superficial thinking could arrive at the idea that there was a land grab by the TPLF. That's pretty clearly not the case. I think, you know, but I don't think the Tigray administration in Mekelle paid anything like enough attention to the changing demographics in Western Tigray, the changing value of land, the fact that land parcels were being digitized, for instance, which meant that many people could see much more clearly who had what. The fact that you had a slightly different attitude towards investors in Western Tigray than you did on the Amhara side, that particular individuals, the famous Colonel Damake, you know, who had been a TPLF fighter, who wanted to get an investment license and was rejected. So he goes across to relatives in Gondar and gets a much more favorable hearing, and the rest is history. That doesn't mean to say that this was always contested land, the way people seem to understand it now. So I think that was a mistake. I think withdrawing back to Addis Ababa, feeling hurt and offended and anxious after Abiy came to power was also a mistake. I remember sitting with the regional government in Mekelle and saying, you need a liaison office in Addis. If you're all going to sit here in Mekelle, apparently plotting and scheming and isolated, politics is still going on. It doesn't stop just because you've withdrawn. So you need somebody sitting in Addis who's still discussing with people and meeting diplomats. And, you know, somebody once said to me, the first rule of politics is be in the room. And I think the dissident group of TPLF found out the hard way that that was an ironclad rule. You need to be in the room if you want to influence the way things go, back in 2001. I suspect there was a bit of that went on also in the period from 2018, when the leadership really kind of left to Mekele and left a void, if you like. I think also it was a mistake to exaggerate the level of your military force. I mean, there's always been a tendency to both despise and fear the TPLF by outsiders, and to see them as kind of all-encompassing, all-powerful, when actually they weren't. They're a bunch of people who make mistakes like anybody else's. And that really led to a situation where they were able to kind of present as much more powerful, particularly military. I mean, you remember the crisis group report that said they had X number of 100,000 people under arms. This was nonsense. So I think that, on the one hand, apparently sounding quite bullish and quite powerful militarily, but without doing the preparation, that was a big mistake, I would say. But can you hold the TPLF responsible for the genocide that was committed against the people of Tigray? I don't think so. Which doesn't mean to say that there doesn't need to be a serious investigation at some point in the future, and a real, a collective reckoning amongst Tigrayans, amongst Ethiopians, not in terms of blame or punishment necessarily, but, in terms of learning and discussing. What do we know? What do we understand? How do we take this forward? This is now part of a very, very brutalizing history. How do we live with this in the future? I'm sorry, I'm not sure I answered your question, but we've gone.
No, you did brilliantly. You did, and I think your last point about who is to blame for the genocide is very important, because in Tigray there is a tendency to overlearn from history and self-blame, to say that we are sort of entirely responsible for what happened to us, and I think that's a serious mistake that people are making. So it's a very important point, and we're going to come back to the so-called.
Before we go on to the next question, let me add another mistake, which is very common. I agree with you. I think it's really important. The other thing which is really important that a lot of people seem to say, and this is maybe more the diplomats and the international community than domestic voices, but I think a lot of people say, oh, well, these are ethnic groups that are different, and this is a kind of ethnic hatred, which is somehow explains in itself. This is nothing to do with some kind of atavistic hatred between Tigrayans and Amharas, Tigrayans and Eritreans, Tigrayans and Oromos, or whatever. This is the work of contemporary politicians who have mobilized people against each other, and in some cases continue to do so in explicit violation of the cessation of hostilities agreement. These are criminal acts by contemporary politicians, which need to be treated as such. That we can't just say, oh, well, yeah, Ethiopia's a multi-ethnic country, this was bound to happen. It wasn't bound to happen at all. It didn't happen for 25 years. Why did it happen now? This is about leadership and decision-making by politicians who could have made other decisions. Sorry, I interrupted you, but go ahead.
No, it was a very important intervention. We're going to come back to the issue of the so-called contested territories. I think the Tigray government is calling them occupied territories, which I think is better than contested. And it's important that you point out their contribution, very, very dangerous contribution of crisis group in normalizing that sort of language.
I think so.
But if you don't mind, Sarah, I'm going to again take you back to 1991, and because you mentioned very important points, the problems that the TPLF faced then in terms of not wanting to seem to be prioritizing Tigray, to be sort of privileging Tigray. I think that's very important, because whatever problems Tigray faced, Somalia faced as well. So if they were doing things to Tigray that they were not doing to Somalia, that wouldn't have been in the spirit of the sense of fairness that was very important in their struggle, and also why they didn't want to go for outright independence. There are some people, of course, today who say that is what they should have done, but I totally understand the problem they faced then, and that's something with which a lot of people in Tigray will understand why going outright for independence wasn't really the smartest thing to do. But I think people would say that the TPLF in 1991 didn't appreciate the magnitude of the problem that Tigray faced historically. You know, the previous regimes, whether the Haile Selassie regime used foreign imported jets to bomb Tigray, the Derg regime did the same. And the reason that those regimes did that to Tigray was because there was an undercurrent of hatred towards Tigrayans. And that hatred towards Tigrayans from significant corners of Ethiopia existed even in 1991. And that if those people were to come to power again, they would do exactly the same, which is what they did from 2018 to now. And that the TPLF didn't quite appreciate that historical fact. I think that is what people would say, because if they did, then they would have taken steps to make sure that Tigray wasn't as vulnerable as it had historically been.
Yeah, it's really hard to see what steps they would have taken. You know, if you're not going to secede and if you're going to be part of the same country, then, you know, everybody has to play by the same rules. So I see what you're saying, and I think there may be some truth in that, because it's really important to remember that the TPLF were a product of the generation that was really strongly influenced by leftist ideas and Marxism, Leninism, and so on. I mean, not only they probably didn't pay enough attention to these kind of historically, you know, undercurrents of grievance, or more than undercurrents, as you say in some cases, but they also thought they could transcend them. You know, this is a revolutionary. The R in EPRDF is really important. This is an organization that thinks it can change the world, right? And also thinks that it's right. So I think there was a sense in which they had this idea that they could change Ethiopia, that, you know, they could transcend these kinds of suspicions or jealousies or whatever. And the key to doing that was economic transformation. So, you know, this idea that, I mean, it is basically the Leninist idea that ethnic identities, they wither in the face of economic growth, and you know, you create a kind of united market, and these things all sort of go away. And I always remember when I was doing my PhD research, which was during the Ethiopia-Eritrean War, so I was had decided to go south instead, because it was obviously a difficult time to be doing research in the north, and looked at this the famous Wagagoda disturbances and protests in Walaita and what was Simeon Omo at the time. And yeah, I remember talking to EPRDF leaders, Berkat Simon and others at the time, saying, you know, how come you didn't realize that you were creating, you know, some really serious resentments between these cadres of these different groups? You know, you can't blame this on the opposition. This is done by EPRDF cadres. And, you know, they basically said, yeah, we didn't really realize that this stuff could be so explosive. And, you know, and that the Simeon Omo case was obviously a relatively sort of localized issue. There was this real idea, for instance, that if only Simeon Omo had the kind of leadership that Tigray had, it could be united in the same way that Aurajawinet had reduced in Tigray, at least to some extent. The same thing could be done amongst these different groups in Simeon Omo, and that actually the language differences were really not that significant. But of course, they forgot that, you know, the incentive structure had changed under federalism, and these small, you know, elites of these groups then had an interest in having their own zone and their own budget and their own jobs and capital where they wanted to be. So I think it's a bit of a digression, but just to say that I think there was a kind of misunderstanding of quite how resilient and how vigorous some of these sentiments could be, especially once you start to feel like you're being oppressed, and how easily and really wickedly they could be deliberately mobilized. And for me, that's what OPDO did in the period from 2014. You know, the kind of nonsensical idea that the Oromo protests were somehow some kind of spontaneous reflection of the Oromo street. Yes, there was a lot of frustration, but perhaps another mistake that EPRDF made was to do too much work on Millennium Development Goals, which were social objectives and not enough on job creation and economic objectives. But that was a global problem, I think, at the time. So yeah, there was frustration and resentment across Oromia amongst young people who couldn't get jobs and who, you know, were watching Ghana TV and seeing all these nice houses that people seem to be living in these Turkish dramas. Why don't I live like that? And why don't I have these opportunities? So there was kind of aspiration. I've got my university degree, but no delivery of economic expectation. So I think they really underestimated the extent to which these kind of ethnicized sentiments would come up. This is why I find it quite ironic, the idea that, you know, it was TPLF who ethnicized Ethiopian politics. They absolutely didn't. You know, these issues, as you say, were well and truly there before they kind of even thought of establishing a Tigray organization. So this was a kind of experimental approach to try to see, okay, centralism hasn't worked. We've just been through 17 years of the Derg. It was excruciating. You know, people tend to forget just how bad the Derg was. You know, it's very easy for a new generation to think about, you know, they read Mengistu's books or they listen to people talking about it. They forget about the Red Terror. They forget about the war with Somalia. They forget about these appalling civil wars with Eritrea and other groups across the country. Of course, which pale into insignificance in hindsight in comparison with what was done in Tigray for this 2 years from November 2020. But nevertheless, so the idea was that, well, we have to do something different. And as, you know, students of Marxism-Leninism, albeit rather pragmatic students of Marxism-Leninism, you're probably right, they did underestimate the kind of resilience of some of these sentiments. After all, you know, I mean, my father's family is Welsh, my mother's family is English, I live on the border between England and Scotland. I can tell you these things do not go away, you know, and it's 300-400 years since there was overt violence in the area that I live in between England and Scotland. But, you know, tens of thousands of people have been slaughtered in that area, and the sentiment lingers on. We saw that very clearly when Scotland had a referendum on secession a few years ago. So this is not just Ethiopia. But should they have done something differently? I mean, they tried something which I think was quite creative, maybe with better leadership, with stronger leadership. I mean, I as you'll see from the book, I lay a lot of the blame for subsequent events on the Haile Mariam period. And Haile Mariam himself, you know, is a kind of perfect example of the fact that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And, you know, if you're simply not prepared to stand up to this kind of really ethnicized and kind of short-term shortcuts to power, mobilizing ethnicity in the interests of your group and your colleagues, the way that has been done in Amhara, but also particularly, of course, with the rise of Abiy and the way he kind of leveraged power, then a lot of bad things will follow. I don't know, again, if I've answered your question. Yes, there's a criticism there, but what could they have done differently to fortify Tigray better? That's a really tough one. That's a really tough one. I mean, it's, you know, it's very easy with hindsight, but sorry, we haven't talked about the relationship with Eritrea, and I think this is another hugely important piece of the puzzle. You know, because the breakdown of relations between the TPLF and EPLF, of course, made Tigray much, much more vulnerable than it might otherwise have been. And that's clear. You know, I think the other miscalculation, if you like, was the idea that the EPLF or the Eritrean Defence Force would not cross the border into Tigray in 2020, and that was clear quite how catastrophic that was as an assumption. So,
no, I was going to say, you mentioned Haile Mariam, and I think and it's a unanimous agreement, at least in Tigray, as far as Haile Mariam was concerned, was that he wasn't good enough, and that the TPLF and the EPRDF in general was not, you know, it wasn't wise for them to have promoted him to be prime minister. I think that's what people wouldn't sort of accuse Haile Mariam of having malicious intent or anything of that nature, but that he just wasn't fit for that purpose to become prime
so,
minister.
and you can understand why he ended up in that situation. I mean, he was, he's kind of clean. I remember when he came to power, somebody saying, I like everything about him apart from his faith. But which was, it was a leftist commentator. But I think the problem with Haile Mariam, I mean, he fulfilled the criteria that he was not an Oromo and not an Amhara. I think it was important to have somebody who kind of balanced those. It was obvious that there was going to be a kind of power struggle between those two large groups. But he also, I think in the end, he wasn't straight. And I think that's the real problem. He was one of the few people who understood the vision and could articulate the vision. I remember interviewing him around the time when Meles died, and there were few who actually really understood what it was that Meles wanted to achieve and that EPLF was trying to achieve through its mass trainings and its mobilization of a very large ruling organization. But in the end, he wasn't straight, and I think he's been part of the problem of putting the blame on Tigrayans. I can understand that some of them were very frustrating to work with, and made his life very difficult. He was the prime minister, the buck stopped with him, and I think just complaining after the event. He also started, there were a number of decisions taken by EPRDF during that period, and including the whole leadership, and this is not just Haile Mariam, which started to get into some of the really problematic ideological and economic territory that I think Ethiopia is now in. It's really important to remember, I mentioned the role of the Gulf states and the fact that this really compromises Ethiopia's sovereignty and changes the rules of war. It's very clear that this kind of highly personalized, highly transactional kind of politics, the involvement of drones used against civilians, as we've seen in Amhara as well as in Tigray and of course Oromia. That's something that started during the Haile Mariam period. The first X $1 billion was approved by Haile Mariam. It was announced by Abiy and claimed by Abiy, but Haile Mariam was the one who negotiated that. There were also quite a lot of shifts of economic policy making. This focus on growth poles and centres of growth and industrial parks, which I think has been spectacularly unsuccessful. Whether it would have been unsuccessful under better, broader management is hard to know. But there was quite a lot of shifting away from the kind of way that EPRDF had done business before during the Haile Mariam period. But the real problem was this sort of loss of control of the political rhetoric and the political cohesiveness and commitment and probity and integrity. I don't know if you remember this really difficult period of the sort of good governance and the Tahadso and trying to clean up the egregious corruption which really exploded, particularly in the Oromia development corridors and some of those small Oromia towns around Addis Ababa. There was a whole spate of court processes getting rid of some of those people because that didn't come to anything, and they're all back in position again after Abiy came to power. But it was. I'm not saying it was an easy job that he had, but I really do think he wasn't up to it and wasn't really prepared to shoulder the blame for that. But you've also got to blame the collective. They started to move apart and started to move in different directions. You had some factionalism within the TPLF, which was not very constructive, to put it mildly. But you also had a lot of tension emerging between the different groups. And I think they should have done a lot more to take that more serious, particularly from the point of view of Tigray leadership, the relationship with the Amhara elite. People like, Haile Mariam did his best to rebuke Gedu and Dargacha, for instance, for making some very inflammatory remarks early on. But it wasn't, and the veterans didn't maintain good relations. One had a sort of sense that there was a sour relation between some of the Amharas and Tigrayans in the older generation. They should have known better than that, I think, in retrospect. Yeah.
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, one of the misgivings that a lot of people have about the TPLF is that their sense of awareness about what is happening around them is simply non-existent, and people see that even now, and a lot of people in Tigray panic because there is a lot of movement in Eritrea and in Ethiopia and in the international community, and actually the past couple of days were very reminiscent of what was happening in 2018 in terms of the anti-Tigray rhetoric, because Tigrayan forces apparently had made some moves towards southern Tigray, towards Alamata. Now there is a there is a flood of anti-Tigray rhetoric from Addis Ababa, and the TPLF in Mekelle doesn't seem to be reacting to those events, and people panic. They see that and they panic. So there is that perennial problem of the TPLF. It seems to many people.
I think one of the long-term criticisms which we've always had of the TPLF, and this goes right back to when I first, got involved in Ethiopia in 87, 88, they've never been very good at propaganda. I mean, they're the opposite end of the spectrum from Abiy, who's really good at propaganda and not much else. I mean, well, no, that's not true. He's very good at setting people against each other. But, they don't do that kind of clear narratives which would win them support. They never have done. They don't think it's necessary. I mean, the 2005 elections was an absolutely classic example of this. They bulldozed half of Addis Ababa just before the elections. I mean, nothing compared to what's been done in the last couple of weeks and months. And then think they're going to win an election. I mean, it was a very, very peculiar thing. This was during Arkebe's period as mayor. And, they didn't really quite have a sense that they needed to kind of mobilize people to win that election, and therefore, had a really nasty shock. There's been this sense, and again, this is a bit colored by kind of Marxist materialism, if you like, that our actions speak for us. The fact that we're bringing people out of poverty, the fact that we're building schools, clinics, the things that they can see with a bird's eye view sitting in Arakilo. But, if you've just had the neighborhood around you demolished, you're not going to care about how many schools that have just been built in another part of the country. So, I think this understanding of populist mobilization tactics, they've never been good at that. And I think that's always been a criticism. And it's almost something they prided themselves on, which is so frustrating. Why, if you're not going to kind of blow your own trumpet, nobody else is going to do that for you, especially not when you are engaging in a development strategy which is deeply unpopular with most of your Western partners, who want you to privatize, who want you to liberalize. They do not want a developmental state with an economy, all of whose levers you still continue to control. But nobody ever bothered to do any narrative or propaganda around why was effort really established, for instance. What was the developmental rationale? They just did it and got on with it and assumed everybody would understand. So I think there's an area of criticism there.
Well, I mean, we haven't had a breather from long trips and conferences, so I shouldn't detain you here for long, Sarah, and I'm asking you to explain countless mistakes of the TPLF, and that's impertinent of me. But if I could have your reflections on two pointers, and we will end it with that. One is something that you touched upon, the so-called contested areas. And one of the points that people in the Amhara political space mentioned is that essentially in 1991 the TPLF annexed land from Amhara. That's what they say. So I want you to tell me on what basis they constituted the regions, essentially the APRDF. What was the assumption that when I think language seemed to have been the primary criterion on which the entire construction was based.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, language was hugely important. And, the whole process went through very quickly. There was this so-called, I think it was a boundary commission that was established. under the chairmanship, I think, of Dawit Yohannes, the Hara ANDM leader. And I think there were a couple, there was a Tigrayan on the commission. Bayene Petros was also there from Hadia. There were a couple of OLF people. So, you know, that was quite an interesting committee, and there was a lot of haggling that went on. For instance, you know, the OLF claimed all of that area around Kamise and into Wollo as Oromo territory, or, you know, Warailu, all sorts of areas, because they used to be Oromo, you know, back in the day. And then, of course, Bayene Petros turned around and said, well, in that case, you know, large chunks of this area belong to Hadia or Sidama or whatever. So at that point, yeah, I think everybody realized that the whole going back to history was a zero-sum game that was just not going to get anywhere, and the only way they could do this was on the basis of contemporary language use. So that's what they deployed. And, you know, I think it's really is uncontested that the overwhelming majority of the population in what became Western Tigray were Tigrinya speakers. Now, there is a more complicated issue about Wolkaite identity, which I think I describe in the book as just waiting to be flipped by a couple of enterprising politicians, because it is a bit distinctive just from a normal Tigray identity or indeed a normal Amhara identity. But yeah, no, I mean, I think language use was the only basis on which it was possible to get any kind of agreement to move forward, and they did need to move forward really quite urgently. You know, this was a country that was looking like it was going to fall apart. And don't forget, you know, this is the period when the former Yugoslavia was falling apart, and so, you know, dividing up the country along the lines of the major language groups was also something highly contested and highly politicized at the time. I think the Eritreans objected. We haven't talked about how the divisions between the TPLF and the EPLF emerged, but this attitude to, you know, subnational language groupings, nationalities, is one of the key divisions between them. So the Eritreans were very quick to criticize it. The South African government also very quickly criticized the new constitutional arrangement because, of course, you know, South Africa was moving from apartheid into the rainbow nation. So, you know, there was a lot of consensus that this was a really weird thing to be doing, quite regressive and problematic. So it wasn't straightforward by any means, but I don't think there was really much other way to do it other than taking something that could be demonstrated and could be tested on a contemporary basis. You know, if you wanted to go back into history, I think it would have been really, really difficult. And don't forget, they were also fighting more sort of public battles on the Eritrea issue. The secession of Eritrea was deeply unpopular in Addis Ababa. And again, you know, it's important to remember the sort of discussions that went on. You know, and Meles went to the university and basically said, you know, if you want to continue to fight to keep Eritrea, we'll arm you and we'll transport you to the border. We'll take you tomorrow. But we don't think that another 30 years of war is the way to proceed. We have to go to something different now. So, but because they had facilitated the secession of Eritrea, I think EPRDF found themselves particularly defensive about other issues of secession or separation. So, for instance, you know, they were, in a way, a centrist government who hadn't got the Eritrea baggage might have been able to oversee the separation of the Somali part of Ethiopia, for instance. But because they were kind of once bitten, twice shy, I think it was very sensitive for them, and they were roundly criticized, of course, by the kind of traditional Addis Ababa elite.
Well, and my second question was going to be the issue of the TPLF and the EPLF, and you mentioned that they have always had fundamental differences. And reading your book, that is the one point that really stands out as far as that is concerned. But one wonders why. Why is it that they have never been able to bridge their fundamental differences? What would you say is the reason? I understand this is a big topic, so we're not going to cover it now. But if you could just give us broad outlines, that would be wonderful.
I think the number one reason is Isaias. I think he's a really difficult, wicked politician. I mean, I think we've talked about all sorts of things that the TPLF can be blamed for, and I don't want to leave people with the impression that the TPLF is to be held responsible for what's happened. They made mistakes, but they're not responsible for some appalling politicians who've made awful decisions, brutal decisions, criminal decisions, and I would put both Abiy and Isaias and some others in that category. So, I think it's partly about I don't think the Eritreans ever really took the Tigrayans seriously. There was a bit of kind of contempt for them. This sort of dirty Agame type idea is very deeply entrenched in the sort of Asmara elite thinking. It's ironic given that Isaias has strong family connections south of the Merab and spent part of his childhood in Adwa. But there is this idea that somehow the Eritreans are superior to the Tigrayans, and I think they certainly didn't expect that the TPLF would emerge to be as powerful as it did. My sense was that they really looked down on the TPLF in the early period in the 1980s. They felt they'd taught them what they knew. I think the difference in attitude on this, the nation's nationalities and people's question is absolutely critical. And people think, oh well, this is it's just an ideological nicety. It wasn't. It was about the future of the state of Eritrea. Eritrea has 9 different language groups, and drawing attention to that was going to be counter to this need of the Eritrean nationalist movement for centrist nation building. So as we've seen in the war, they're not above mobilizing some of these smaller groups in order to carry out some of the worst atrocities in Tigray. So I think there was that sense of, who on earth are these Tigrayans? They're just a bunch of country bumpkins. We're the sophisticated ones. We're the older organizations. We taught them everything they know. I think the other thing which really distinguishes them is that the TPLF in its early days always had a very, very close relationship with the rural populations, which is true to some extent of the EPLF, though they always had kind of base areas. They didn't move quite as much. And I think that was what was critical to the success of the TPLF, and also what made them interesting from a political point of view. Is one of the reasons I've continued to work on Ethiopia for all these decades, is that it's very unusual to get an organization which is really interested in social transformation of rural populations. And the TPLF had a very different attitude to that in the beginning, certainly, than the EPLF did. I think, incidentally, we can blame the TPLF for many different things, but the most important thing that we should all be focusing on now is what are they doing to make sure that Tigray's rural population is fed and can get water and kids can go to school. All of this politics and analysis of the war is secondary. The really important thing, which is what made TPLF interesting in its early days, was that they understood that the peasantry, the farmers, supported them, not because they spoke to them in Tigrinya or sang great Tigrinya songs or had pictures of the Aksum Halt on their logo. It was because they were delivering something, this idea of shoit, the relief grain which was brought by these trucks from Sudan, for instance. It was critical to seeing this kind of political contract, which was underpinned by serving the interests of the rural majority. And if that is lost, and it's certainly been really badly shaken, I think, in the period since Koha, because of the starvation, because of their inability to support this population, that's a very, very profound erosion of an important political contract. But to go back to the relationship with the Eritreans, I think the other problem is that Isaias never really saw the independence of Eritrea as Eritrea was never a big enough stage for him. It was a means to an end to control Ethiopia and the rest of the Horn. And he's been quite consistent with that. There's a very nice article by Harry Verhoeven, or maybe a podcast talking about how consistent he is, whether he was in the liberation movement or in government, whether he was sanctioned, whether he was back out of his box again as recently. He's really been consistent in trying to kind of destabilize the whole of Ethiopia. So I think, his anger in the 1990s when he discovered that the TPLF, EPRDF were planning to build their own factories in Tigray and Amhara, and they were not just going to be sending raw materials from Ethiopia to Eritrea for them to take the profit. I think that was really a kind of profound beginning of a really deep power struggle between the two, and there it stuck. And we're still left with a very, very problematic boundary ruling as a consequence of Algiers and the Ethiopia-Eritrea war. Our colleagues from Europe, for instance, know very well just how problematic the so-called conclusion of the Ethiopia-Eritrea Boundary Commission has been in practice and remains. So this is not finished yet, and it's really very, very sad. These are poor populations which have very, very close historical relationships, family relationships, and until this is resolved, the irony of seeing, for instance, Abiy nominated for a Nobel, given a Nobel Peace Prize for making peace with the Eritreans, when one knew that it was the TPLF who were pushing for a shift in strategy on the Eritrea border, because it was Tigray that was suffering from that border being closed. So, there are many, many ironies. The idea that both the TPLF and the EPLF have been described as secessionists when they had such incredibly different strategies on this issue. There's so many interesting and really devastating details in all of this history. So I hope it's a useful introduction, what we've been able to write with Martin. It is, of course, only the beginning, and I think there's an awful lot more to be written. And it's great to see so many other things which are not being published about the war.
Well, thank you very much, Sarah. I think you have a lot of expertise and knowledge on Ethiopia, and thank you for writing some of that in the book. As I said earlier, the chapters that you contributed focus on providing very, very authoritative context. So I strongly recommend people to buy the book and to read. And there is such a high demand for knowledge now in Tigray because, like I said, people are trying to grapple with what happened, why it happened, and so I think your book would be an important contribution to that soul searching that Tigrayans having to go through.
Yeah.
Yes.
But I think maybe one final point. I do think it's incredibly important to remember. I mean, in my view, and this is part of the narrative of the book, I think, once Abiy and Isaias got together through the good offices of Anti-Tigray and others, it was very hard to see how the war could have been avoided. And I think, it's really important to remember that there are the protagonists of this war. There are the people who engineered this war, who wanted it to happen, who wanted to undermine and destroy Tigray and the TPLF. And however much one is critical of the TPLF, I don't think that is at their door. I think this is coming. They were attacked from the federal government and the Eritrean government, and it's really important to remember that. On the other hand, it's really important not to be naive. I mean, I've heard journalists say that, well, if you say that the war was unavoidable in the way that you seem to be saying, then doesn't that let the TPLF off the hook? No, I don't think so. I think there are plenty of criticisms to be made still, and things to be discussed, which must be discussed within Tigrayan society and wider Ethiopian society. But that doesn't mean to say that there wasn't this really vicious and wicked determination to do something incredibly brutal, which, maybe not all of it was planned. I think some of the crimes which were committed by the Eritrean forces in particular were clearly planned. Some of the things which were done by Amhara forces and indeed ENDF were planned. There must be justice and accountability for that. And it may take decades. These things often do take decades, but it will come eventually. I'm quite confident of that. I don't think Ethiopia can move on without that. But it's important to to be realistic, and also to see that there are many, many different causes of these things. So saying that the war became unavoidable when Abiy and Isaias made common cause is not to say that the TPLF weren't also responsible for a number of mistakes. I think both can be true, and we need to hold these things in tension when we make an analysis. But thanks, I've enjoyed the conversation. I hope it was useful.
Indeed, it was. And the book is Understanding Ethiopia's Tigray War by Martin Plaut and Dr. Sarah Vaughan. I've been calling you Sarah, but the full package would be Dr. Sarah Vaughan. So please do go and buy the book and read it. And Sarah, thank you so much for joining today. I understand, again, you've been very, you have a very busy schedule, so I'm doubly grateful for that. And I hope you're going to join us on again in the future. But for today, thank you very much.
Thank you too. That would be my pleasure.